Wow. Today, we have got one hell of an episode. Let's hear a brief intro from Wanda and Richard and then jump into the full conversation.
I'm Wanda Muñoz. I'm based in Mexico and I'm part of the Human Security Network in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I work on assistance to victims of war, the rights of people with disabilities, and humanitarian disarmament.
Hi there, and I'm Richard Moyes. I work for Article 36, which is a non-governmental organisation based in the UK. We work on issues of weapons law and weapons policy, and I guess I've spent pretty much my whole working life working on those kind of themes, talking mainly about how we're allowed to kill each other, which is a bit of a gloomy subject, but fascinating all the same.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Are You a Robot? This is a series where we aim to tackle some of the greatest questions and challenges that arise from AI and related technologies. Today, we've got an incredible account of that. This is one of the greatest questions that arises, like, no doubt. We're talking about killer robots and autonomous killer robots. It may seem a bit like sci-fi, but Wanda and Richard come to talk to us about what is happening, where we are, where they hope to bring things, and how they hope to make sure that we don't ever live in a society that there are killer robots going about their business and having the power to inflict force on anyone, anywhere. Now, this conversation does not end here. I encourage you, if you like anything that we're talking about, please join us in our Slack community, which you can find a link for in the description below. There are some brilliant people in that community, and they are giving their opinions on what they feel the state of the world is. We're sharing best practices. We're sharing cool events that are going on. I highly encourage you to jump in it if this at all piques your interest and you like thinking about AI ethics or data governance or all this other nerdy stuff that I myself enjoy. So that's, again, the Slack community. You can find the link in the description below. Jump in it, say hi. Last but not least, I want to give a huge shout out to our sponsors, Ethics Grade. They are doing some really cutting edge stuff when it comes to ESG work. If you don't know what ESG is, that is the measurement of companies that they have and their, sorry, let me say that again. If you don't know what ESG is, that is the measurement of the non-financial impact a company has on the world. And what Ethics Grade is doing is they're going around and they're gathering all of this data to be able to rate companies on their data governance, on their AI ethics programs, and a slew of other pieces. You can download scorecards of these different companies that Ethics Grade has rated, and you can compare the two or three, or however many you would like to compare. How Facebook's AI ethics or data governance program compares against Twitter or Clubhouse. It's really fascinating stuff. I encourage you to check out what Ethics Grade is doing. They're putting up new companies that they've rated on their website every day. Go and check it out. It's ethicsgrade.io. Again, you can find the link for that in the description below. Without further ado, let's talk with Wanda and Richard about killer robots.
Are you a robot?
Welcome to both of you. I am highly excited for this chat because I think these are conversations that we need to be having. They're difficult conversations, and there's a lot of gray area that's involved in this. And what we wanted to talk about today was the use of autonomous robots, the use of AI in the military, killer robots, as some people like to fanatically call it. And I don't think there's anybody better than the both of you to discuss this. And so first thing that we can jump into is, where are we now? And what is the current situation? Because there's probably a lot of us that think the military or the governments are doing a lot of stuff. We've seen lots of different displays of maybe drones or or uses of autonomous weapons in the news, and we've heard about it, but I'd love to know what exactly is the current situation. And maybe Wanda, you can start us off with that.
Thank you, Demetrius. First, I would like to start by defining a little bit what we are talking about, because sometimes when we hear about autonomous weapons or killer robots, people think about cyborgs and terminators, and it looks like we're crazy talking about this, but this is not what we are talking about. We're talking about weapons that would select and engage the targets. That means attack the targets without meaningful human control, based on input from sensors and analysis of that information, and without someone actually taking the decision of life and death. So this has, of course, a lot of problems from different perspectives that we can come back to that later, no? But from ethics, international humanitarian law, human rights, security, etc. And right now, where we stand is that we know that some countries are already trying to develop these weapons, and there are some precursors of these weapons, but they have not been used. And I think there's sometimes confusion between drones that are being used. Here in Mexico, there have been attacks of drones with explosive against police, but these are weapons that are controlled by someone that is knowing exactly what happened and when to attack. And then what we are talking about is that weapons that would select and engage the targets that are the critical functions of a weapon without meaningful human control.
I think what Wanda says there, she emphasized the sort of role of sensors in these systems. And I think for us, that's a key thing to recognize. We're really talking about this direct link, this direct sort of chain of action from sensor inputs in a system to some sort of calculation to some sort of application of force coming out the other end of that system. So it's the chain of sensor inputs, machine calculation, force occurring without a human deliberating on specifically where and specifically when that application of force occurs. And we already have systems that do work in that kind of way. It's really a direction of travel that I think we see now with improvements in sensor technology or developments of sensor technology, with greater and greater computing power and greater communications capabilities. We see the sort of potential for systems functioning that way to be put into operation over longer periods of time or over wider areas, and also using more complicated like sensor representations or more complicated processing mechanisms, so that it really becomes difficult for the users to fully understand specifically what the effects of that system are going to be. I mean, we should probably touch base with some of the existing systems a little bit to describe where we're at as well, but I don't want to just talk on and on.
Yes, please do.
Should I throw a few on the table, Wanda? I mean,
yes.
I think
Go ahead.
we already see sort of missile defense systems that are using radar signatures, and they're scanning an area of the sky to identify the radar signatures of incoming missiles, and then the weapon system is targeting, essentially firing a gun at the source of that radar signature. So in that context, we have the weapon system itself aiming and targeting, firing at the specific object that it's being triggered against. Even the most basic level, in a way, landmines. Some of us have worked for many years on the issue of landmines, but they're a very simple system that uses a sensor, waits in the ground. The user doesn't know exactly when it's going to detonate, but that pressure sensor then is subject to a calculation, and you get the explosive force at the other end. So you already have that loop. What we're looking at with future technologies is the potential of those to be more complicated and, of course, to be more mobile over wider areas or longer durations.
I'm glad you mentioned the missiles that are scanning the sky, because that was one question that I wanted to ask about what's happening right now, or a few days ago, in Israel, and what they called the iron bubble. Would that be considered some of this autonomous weaponry?
Yeah, the Iron Dome system is definitely functioning within this kind of mode. And I think for us, we need to recognize that these existing technologies are part of the discussion. I don't think we would say that that's a technology that poses serious humanitarian concerns or serious moral and ethical concerns. In fact, that could be an illustration of us being able to recognize that there is a utility to having machine decision-making involved in these processes. But in the case of those systems, the user, they understand what it's going to target. They understand the area in which it's functioning. They can make decisions about the risks that are being produced by that, the functioning of that system. They can turn it on and they can turn it off. So they control the duration of its functioning. So it's definitely on this path. But for us, it would be a system, not one that should be prohibited, but rather one that we think would fall under meaningful human control, as it's usually used in current circumstances.
Yeah. So I think about like the black box nature of machine learning. And from what I understand is really what you're honing in on, what you're focusing on is when there is no human in the loop and lives or danger is danger is happening, right? And so the human is taken away from the equation. And so I think about machine learning and these black box models that if you ask someone, how did it get that result? They have no idea. And then I think about that being applied to potentially taking lives, and I get a little bit scared. Is that what you're talking about right now?
Yes, that's part of what we're talking about now, exactly, Demetrius, because one of the problems is that people would be farther away geographically from the situation and from the time in which the force is being applied. And we see that with the technology now, there's a lot of problems with the black box when it's applied to any topic. But we have seen the consequences in health, in education. There's a lot of concerns of how this is being used in law enforcement. So how can people even consider about using this for life and death situations? There's also the question of accountability, because with the black box, as you said, we cannot really explain why a decision was taken instead of another one. So if a civilian is killed or a civilian infrastructure is a target, who's going to be responsible if we cannot even explain why the machine took this decision and not a different one? So this is one of the many issues that are raised.
So is it only that? Because I wonder about where you draw the line. I know that AI and machine learning is being used more and more every day in the military. And there are ships that need less crew. There's airplanes or fighter pilots that can do much more. And because they're leveraging AI, but ultimately there's a human in the mix. So is that where the line gets drawn? When there's no human in the mix, that's where you say, whoa, we need to really take a step back and make sure that this is not happening for these reasons. Because I think about all of the horror stories I've heard just with machine learning classifier models gone wrong, or something that, like you were talking about, like bias in certain applications of the different machine learning that is out in the wild right now, and how poorly it's performed. And these are not life and death.
Exactly.
But yeah, we are talking about life and death here. And so is it just that in your eyes, it's okay to leverage it as much as possible, as long as there still is that human that's making the final decision?
I could say that we are not against the use of AI in the military, just like as a blanket statement, because it can be useful to support and to inform decision making. But it should not be a machine that is deciding when to apply the force or not. And I'm glad also that you mentioned the issue of bias, because that is also one of our concerns that, as you know, I think it's being widely, not as wide as I wish, but it's being discussed more and more. And I'm sure you know about the Netflix documentary Coded Bias that is bringing light into these issues and putting it more out there for the general population. But I would like to give one example, for example, from the work that has been done by Joy Bulamwini and the MIT lab. And they found that in facial recognition, the error for the recognition of white men is 1%. And for the recognition of dark-skinned men is 19%. And for the recognition of dark-skinned women is 35% of error. So this is just one example of bias. And then if we take it that this kind of technology could be used in life and death situations, is really unacceptable. There's also recently that I read that there was some company in the military that was trying to pitch their products for the use of AI in this kind of situation. And during the example and the presentation they were given, the machine mistook a tree for a person. So these are like real concerns. And sometimes when we hear from the military or defense industry, it looks like, AI is this great, amazing thing that will solve all the problems, and it is not. And we are already seeing all these problems, as I mentioned, in employment, in housing. That's why, for example, there have been some moratoriums against the use of facial recognition by police in the US because of all these problems. Mm-hmm. So if this is unacceptable for these other issues and for these other rights to employment, to health, to education, why is it not unacceptable, or why should not it be banned when it's the right to life that is on the line?
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on something that you mentioned, Richard, about the future applications of this and how it's gone from being a landmine to now where we're at, and what are the future applications of this? What can we expect?
Yeah, I might just loop back a little bit to something you said earlier about drawing the lines, and maybe use that to think about where the trajectory is going. I mean, totally agree with what Wanda said in terms of our concern really being in the specific sort of machine decision making when it comes to what to blow up or where to fire, when to fire, force at a target or an object. And there are going to be other applications of AI across all sorts of areas of the military. And I wouldn't say those are unproblematic, right? I mean, if you have human decision makers who are making decisions purely on the basis of a sort of bureaucratic apparatus that's being shaped so much by machine decisions and classifications of data into particular channels and the like, then already the human aspect of that decision making is being sort of pulled in a particular direction. Exactly. So all of that is going to be developing, or is developing as well. And not suggesting that it's unproblematic, but our particular concern when we're thinking about the campaign to stop killer robots is in this very sharp end to do with decisions around where and when force gets made and the role of machines in that. We think we do need to draw some clear lines, and I think one of those is just going to be a line against systems that function on the basis of sensors targeting people. I think if you take the targeting of people by systems that use sensors as a sort of basis for decision making, take that off the table altogether, then many of the issues around bias and the like, you take those off the table at the same time in some of their worst implications, because the most pernicious aspects of this would be if we start to suggest that machines can divide people into goodies and baddies, right? We're going to say our machine system can say they're a military combatant, they're the people we can target, and our machine is going to say they're a civilian. And already, you can imagine how that starts to fix down identities and labels in a certain way. Combatants are going to be what? People with beards and mustaches and darker skin. And before you know it, instead of that human in the moment decision about whether somebody can be targeted or not, you've embedded all sorts of potentially very problematic assumptions into the way that systems work. So just a blanket rejection of systems targeting people. No targeting of military people, no targeting civilian people, of course. Take those systems off the table, you deal with a lot of problems there. But then there's still other concerns, and that's when you come to systems that are going to target military objects like fighting vehicles, tanks, this kind of thing. You still need those systems to be controllable by the people that are using them. The person who's using them has to be able to make a meaningful decision about the use of that system. And that means being able to understand how it functions. If there's a black box at the center of that system, which means they don't really know what it targets or why it targets what it targets, they can't really explain why the system does what it does, then I think there's a fundamental moral and ethical problem there, but there's also probably a practical problem of control. And similarly, systems that can't, that change their parameters of operation after they're put into use, if they're still sort of learning in some way or developing their mode of operation. So no targeting of people, and then no use of systems that can't be effectively controlled. And I think some of these machine learning structures would be implicated in that latter category quite distinctly, because object recognition is a fraught business, as Wanda suggested, and not just in terms of the biases that can be embedded in it, but in terms of our inability to really know what kind of error states we're gonna end up with. And well, when it comes to blowing things up, there's of course big risks in going in that direction.
May I comment on something that you said, Richard? I'd like to come back a little bit to the part on what could we say about this from an ethical perspective? Because I think there's one aspect of ethics where that is what we have been discussing mainly so far. That is that there could be a mistake done by the machine that we would not be able to explain as to why it targeted a civilian instead of some military objective. No, so that is. When we talk about this, we are thinking about the consequences and something that could go wrong. But there's another aspect of ethics where we don't even look at the result, but just at the process, and where we could say even if it targets a combatant, it's still not acceptable, because a machine should not be the one taking the decision, because that could go against human dignity. And I think, of course, there are many other arguments, but for me this is the main one. That what message would we send? No, if we say, like, people, we value your life so little that just leave a machine to do it. And I think we don't want to live in a society like that. And many of us that are in the campaign, I think, are of this view. And this is why we're working on this. And just let me add something else quickly. This is something I wanted to mention too, because I think initially when some of us heard about autonomous weapons and the sensors and AI, it's a little bit of a scary topic, because I am not an engineer. And so we feel like it's a little bit difficult to approach. And I think some people, probably from the diplomats, also try to put it in this frame, like, no, but this is something about technology and the military, so why are you even here? But what we have been discussing and sharing with the colleagues, with the general population, with students, etc., is that this is not just about technology and military, but this is about the kind of society we want, and this is going to impact us, because we are thinking about situations of conflict. But if these technologies exist, they could certainly at some point be used by the police, or on national security, or even by illegal or no-state groups, by the general population, etc. So we need to get involved, because these are decisions that concern us and will affect our future.
Totally agree with Wanda on that. And just thinking back to your earlier point, Wanda, we always needed to remember that machines don't see people as people. It's a process allowing force to be applied on the basis of sensor inputs into machines. It's just a process of reducing real people and their human identity into just a pattern of data points to be essentially just mechanically processed. And I think in that reduction is right at the heart of what Wanda was saying there about not a consequentialist ethics, but a kind of morality just in the process itself. And on that latter set of points about society, I mean, if we don't take off the table killing people on the basis of machine decision-making and killing people on the basis of algorithms, then I think that has an effect on how we can construct arguments about the role of AI and machine decision-making in other parts of society. Because if killing people is allowed on the basis of machine decisions, then you can't really argue that there's an extent of harm which is too great, in relation to my mortgage application or something, that creates a hard boundary. So it's a matter of constructing some hard boundaries within this space. Otherwise, we're opening the door to a whole load of uncertainty in other areas, or a creeping kind of handover of significant human decisions to machinery at the end of the day. So this is just doubling down on Wanda's point that there's implications from these discussions in this weapons space, which is often put to one side. Maybe that's a bit of a segue onto the European rules you've been looking at, Wanda, but put into one side, too often this military stuff. But actually, it has a significance for how these discussions take place in society across the board.
Before we jump into the European Union stuff, because I do want to get into that, to your point, Wanda, and letting it become something that is used by potentially police or the government on its own citizens. I wonder about this, and also drawing this hard line and saying that we don't want the technology to do this. Is it not correct to say that that technology is already out there and it is live, we could say? We haven't seen it be deployed on anything, but it is out there. So what you're arguing for is that this technology be basically that the governments say they will never use this. Is that what it is?
The way that I would put in the metros is like this. We are asking for an international treaty that makes sure that the use of force is that meaningful. Sorry that I usually say this in Spanish, so I need to see how to phrase it properly in English. That we need an international treaty that ensures the meaningful human control of the use of force and advanced autonomous weapons. But I want to insist autonomous weapons with the definition that we are saying that those that select and engage targets, because some countries conveniently, they refer to other things that is not specifically what we're talking about. We're focusing on these two critical areas that we want to make sure are always under the control of a meaningful control of a person taking the decision. And for that, well, maybe Richard can say more about this. There's a diplomatic process going on where these discussions are taking place. But our goal, yes, is that we have an international treaty on this topic that puts clear boundaries.
Yeah, states, governments at the United Nations have been discussing this issue for 7 years now in a conference in Geneva, and they're going to be having a big meeting at the end of this year. Given the situation with COVID, it might get delayed into next year, but they're having a big conference of this framework where they really should be deciding that this is the time to start negotiations of an international legal treaty on this issue. Now, whether or not they will make that decision at the end of the year, that's one of the key things that we're working on. We'll be pushing for them to do that. If they don't take that step, then we need to see groups of states start to work separately from that UN forum to actually set up this legal treaty on their own terms. But we think that international legal instrument needs to be put in place, and that can set the rules and the boundaries. Legal instruments, of course, don't just apply themselves, though. What they can do is allow us as a society as a whole to create a sense of, a normative framework in this area where it becomes recognized that it's just unacceptable to use technologies where machines are deciding to apply force to humans. And we create a moral stigma around technologies that function in that way, a taboo around systems that function in that way. So even if not all states join this treaty, and I think if we're being honest, our expectation would be not all states will join this treaty. But if we get a group of states to draw a line to say, you're not allowed to use systems that target people on the basis of sensors, or you're not allowed to use systems that are using machine learning in this way, that means they can't be effectively controlled, then I think that sort of normative pressure will shape the behavior of other states. It'll shape the way that technologies are developed, and it'll have an effect anyway. And I'm pushing that point because I think it's important for all of us to develop and to hold on to a sense of empowerment and belief in relation to these things. One of the challenges in society these days is it's often very difficult for people to feel that we have the mechanisms collectively to actually exert an influence on these things. But this can be done. We've done it on other weapons-related issues. We've developed other treaties prohibiting certain weapons. They've resulted in thousands, millions of weapons being destroyed as a result. Not all states have joined them, but they've had a major humanitarian impact. They've shaped the normative landscape, and we can do that again on this issue. And we need people in the tech community and in wider communities concerned with the role of technology in society to engage with this set of military issues and help us in that process, because you'd be really welcome, I guess.
Yes, can I add
talking
a
to the outside
little?
world.
Yeah, can I add a little bit into that? Yes, I think these examples that Richard was giving are really important, because also sometimes I think one may think, oh yeah, these people, they just want to ban war, and but I mean, I wish I could ban war, but what is important to know is that we are working on this topic to ban autonomous weapons, because there's a lot of precedents already from other weapons that have been banned, like Richard mentioned, landmines, cluster munitions, blinding lasers. So this is something that is done, that has been achieved also through a huge push and involvement from the civil society. So these mechanisms exist, and we know it's doable. But for it to be doable, I think in the short term, we need to have more people raising their voices, because some of the governments feel, as I said before, like there's this couple of diplomats with their military attaches taking the decisions, and they're not necessarily, carrying out consultations in their own countries with the general population to see if they want autonomous weapons or not. So there's already thousands of scientists in AI that have signed a letter saying that they are against this. The UN Secretary General has also mentioned. I think what I think the words were that these weapons were morally repugnant. The ICRC also recently launched a position to raise their concerns of this. So there's a lot of voices that are being raised, but we need more people to say, government, I don't want these weapons, and you better change your position, because this needs to be banned. And I think one of the challenges that I see, to be honest, and for example, here in Mexico, is that, first of all, there are so many challenges that we already have without thinking even about AI. But secondly, for people that really work in AI, some of the main concerns now are around privacy, for instance, or around, I say, more these elements of access to employment, and how human resources are using AI, etc. And this sounds like something too far away from the reality, but it is not. So I really encourage people to look for us, to look at the website stopkillerrobots.org, and join the conversation, because these decisions are going to be taken anyway. So either we participate and we influence them, or they're going to be taken by other people who probably don't have the same human rights concerns like we do.
One thing that I wonder about, and I see this point, this is a valid point, of banning something like this, just as we've banned chemical warfare. And the chemical warfare does still happen, but it is looked upon by the greater society as atrocity, and as it should be. And these countries that decide to not sign a treaty, if a treaty were to come into play, does that not give them a leg up on the rest of the world? Is this not like going to start, or maybe it's already in the process of having some kind of AI or autonomous weapon arms race?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I wouldn't think that taking off the table the potential to have machines making decisions to kill people should be a sort of crippling disadvantage from a military perspective. I certainly think we need to be working to shape a sense in society that can't be a military disadvantage. If it let me formulate this again. I feel it would be a shame for society if it's considered a disadvantage to take having machines decide to kill people off the table. If that's where advantage lives in the world, if you gain an advantage in the world we're living in because you're prepared to have machines kill human beings and other people aren't, then we're saying that the sort of social and political advantage lies with a sort of form of brutality and barbarism. And that's not technology taking us to a better future. That's technology taking us to a very dark future, and one which we should be extremely wary of in its sort of underpinning social and political implications. Now, I don't think we want to really use the spectre of a sort of dystopian future as the basis for this work, but we definitely don't want to be given a sort of sense of belief that the political foundations of our shared future lie with machines making decisions to kill people and technologies that can't be effectively controlled being used to apply force around the world. I think you should be able to take those two things off the table and commit to sort of morally appropriate behavior, commit to applying existing legal rules in conflict. And we should be able to think within our society that is going to be the way forward, and we should be investing in our belief in that, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'd also like to comment on that. I give you the example of one diplomat from a country that I won't tell you which one, but he was telling us exactly that. No, but how can we ban autonomous weapons because other countries will have autonomous weapons, so I have to have them. And I was like, but so do you mean is then because there's one country that puts the lowest standard and the worst atrocity that can be, then we all have to go to that standard? No. What we have to do is to raise it. And as we said before, this is what we have seen, for example, from the landmines before they were banned. I don't have the exact numbers in mind, but there were countries that were using them, that were producing them, and then with so many years after the ban, even the countries that have not signed the treaty or ratified the treaty are not using them anymore because exactly there's a collective understanding from the international community that this is unacceptable. So yes, there's one or two countries that still have them, but it's nothing compared to the situation in which we were before, because there was this force from the largest number of countries and from the civil society that said this is unacceptable. So we need to be looking at how we raise that standard, not everyone going lower to the worst countries that don't care about human rights, even if they say they do. And also just to put it out there that there's with the arsenal of weapons that there's already exist in the countries, how many times can we kill the humanity? do we need to add something that it's not even a human but a machine that also now can kill humanity? There's all these things need to be discussed as well.
Yes. So this is not necessarily my viewpoint, but I feel the question must be raised, because I'm sure you've heard it as you are going about this initiative and trying to create change. And I imagine some people have said, well, when you have these robots, and I'm thinking in my head about a drone swarm, and someone says, okay, and they, first of all, well, there's two parts to this. One person just presses a button and releases a drone swarm. And how is that different than pressing a button and releasing a missile? But then the other piece of this that I can't stop thinking about is, if this drone swarm can go in and it will go into a building and maybe kill a few civilians, but also hopefully kill someone that is the right target, how is that different right now than the missiles that are being fired at buildings and there's hundreds of civilian deaths, but you get the right one, and so then it makes it all worth it. You get that target that you were looking for, but they were inside of a housing complex. So the difference is there. I imagine you've heard people talk about that, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts from my side. First of all, there's a lot of unpleasant and unacceptable things about the way that force is conducted in the world today with the weapons that we've got, right? It's not, the problems of violence in the world are not confined to future technologies, but they're also deeply embedded in the way that we think it's acceptable to blow up buildings in densely populated areas and to bomb and bombard areas of, containing huge numbers of civilians and causing large numbers of casualties and deep harm. I think in relation to the sort of points of difference here, one of them does go back to the point Wanda made earlier in my mind, which is about the process, the idea of processing a human through this sort of machine recognition and reduction to an object. That has a sort of moral component to it that is deeply problematic. It suggests that we can embed into technologies these identifications, these identifiers of who's a goodie and who's a baddie. And I think we need to be very careful of that direction of travel. There's sometimes, I think, in this discourse, a tendency to imagine that violence is something that can be perfected. And if only we just program the machines to do violence perfectly, then actually it will be a better future that we're moving towards. But to my mind, violence is always a product of some kind of human failing, right? And I think that we as people, we have failings, and we have failings as individuals and failings as social units. And I think we can't expect violence to be undertaken absent some of that. We can't perfect it. We can't do it perfectly. We can't decide for all time that this is how we know what a baddie looks like and this is how we know what a goodie looks like, because we've done that in the past in our societies. We've created bureaucratic structures to identify certain people as appropriate to be taken away and killed in various regimes at different points in time, different signifiers. A couple of us on this call have been wearing glasses, right? I think under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, wearing glasses was an indicator that you were not trustworthy for the revolution, and you could be killed on that basis. So it's not like as a society we haven't had these sort of the belief that we knew now what the indicators were by which we could tell goodies from baddies. I think there's a sort of deep hubris potentially in thinking that, well, we've learned from that and now we can just program it into a machine and leave it there. So I think that underpinning ethical sort of component is still at the heart of the point of difference here. And this is just recognizing, perhaps back to our previous framing, again, Wanda and I are not suggesting that there is no role for machine decision-making of some kind in technologies in these areas. It's just specifically about deciding who to kill, or, well, not deciding to kill people at all, and in systems that can't be effectively directed and can't be effectively controlled in their operation.
Mm-hmm. If I just may add something quickly, just to insist on what Richard mentioned, that there's, of course, a lot of problems right now with the way war is conducted, as we can see from different contexts at the moment. But it's not because there are problems right now with the current use of existing weapons that when we do not need to address the other ones. We need to address both. We need to address what's going on now, and we need to improve accountability mechanisms. But we also need to prevent that worse things will happen, because there's, just to quickly mention some of the principles of international humanitarian law that need to be considered before an attack. That is a proportionality, military necessity, distinction between civilians and combatants, and this is impossible. As I mentioned, the machine could not differentiate between a tree and a person. So how is it going to be programmed, all of this? Of course, a machine, in any way you program it, it will not have human judgment, and with all the blocks problems, it's going to be more difficult to establish responsibility, accountability, and that's why we cannot let this happen.
These are both great answers, and I appreciate you talking about this. I think that is the heart of the problem, is that violence is a horrible solution, and there's no humane way to do violence. So let's jump into the EU regulations, because I think that is something that surprised a lot of people. And Richard, I know you have a few thoughts on it, and you can speak more to this. The EU seems like they released their new regulation, or they haven't released it, or it hasn't become law yet, but they've released drafts of it. And there's nowhere in there that it talks about the military use of AI. And do you feel that is for some of these reasons we've been talking about, that the EU feels like they'll be left behind and they don't want to be the first one to do it, especially if no one else is doing it?
I'm just going to comment very quickly, but I think Wanda probably has a better feeling for this sort of terrain than me. But the first thing I would just say is that the document says this doesn't apply to the military. I just don't think that's quite how ethics and morality work in the world. I think you can't just say, this doesn't have any relationship to that, because we say so on this piece of paper. Okay, maybe it doesn't apply in some legal sense, but it has a bearing in terms of the meaning and the morality. And much that's said in this actually brings out themes that I think are very important to us in terms of why we would reject the sorts of weapon technologies that we've been talking about here. So despite the fact that EU institutions have said this doesn't apply to the military, I think we're going to find that it does apply in a sort of more moral and ethical way when we start to sort of leverage the arguments around it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for me, what was quite shocking was to see that this EU Commission new rules and actions on AI for excellence and trust in AI. And how do you want to promote trust in AI and you leave completely out the military? I really, truly was shocked to see the Article 2 explicitly saying that this does not apply to does not apply to AI systems developed or used exclusively for military purpose. Because first of all, I asked, who is the EU Commission delegating this responsibility to? Or do we now think that the military can rule themselves? Or I really would like to get, together with the people in the EU Commission and tell them, please explain me what the rationale is behind and who is the responsible to guarantee the rights of Europeans if you go forward with this one. But I agree with Richard that the way the new rules are drafted, there's a lot of interesting elements that can be useful for us as well. But the EU Commission should not be. I often say this: like you cannot have it both ways. So you cannot say ethical AI, trustworthy AI, but let's not talk about the military because then what are we saying? We're not being coherent. And I would say, Ben, I don't think this is like in good. You cannot in good faith have this argument that you want AI to be explainable, not trustworthy, etc. But let's not talk about the military. But what I find interesting is the approach that they took, what they call a risk-based approach. So exactly instead of looking at one specific kind of machine learning or Bayesian, I don't know what, they're looking at the different outcomes and the impact. And so in the part that is really prohibited AI, they say that is that causes unacceptable risk and a clear threat to safety, livelihoods, and the rights of people will be banned. So when first I read this, I said, oh, and then Article 2 scope says, but this doesn't apply to the military. So I think this is the kind of thing that we need to be concerned about or in the lookout. And just coming back to accountability from the EU Commission, that they should be able to explain the rationale behind this and not just leave it pass by. But as these EU regulations, there's other frameworks like the OCDE principles on AI. There's the current negotiations on a UNESCO recommendation on ethics in AI. And there's a lot of countries participating there, committing to human-centric AI, to AI that should be used only for human rights. There was a meeting for 46 Asian countries on AI, and they were talking about how AI should be used on, I don't have the exact words here, but to live in harmony, to leave no one behind, based on the values of inclusion and diversity. And you cannot say that and then go into the CCW forum, where is the diplomatic forum where these discussions are held, and say that actually autonomous weapons are fine. So I think part of the work that we do and want to do more in the campaign is exactly to be holding countries accountable to their other commitments. It's not just what you say in CCW, but we are looking at what you say in other forms. And this is to name a few related to AI, because there's also what goes on when they are discussing sustainable development goals in the UN General Assembly. And they're saying completely different things that are not coherent with this. So we need to be mindful and and tell them that we are looking at them and this is not coherent.
Yeah, I think that's totally right in terms of the sort of dynamics that we need to see. I mean, far too often there's this sort of exceptionalism for the military space and just a sort of idea that we could just suspend the sort of rules of evidence and the rules of analysis and the general sort of analytical practices that we would use elsewhere. Yeah. And it's really not good enough in this kind of space. I mean, there's a huge industry, I feel like intellectual industry in a way, of people talking about the ethics of AI and the morality of AI and all of this. Well, it's the whole sector of work is a joke if it just can say, well, we're doing all that, but of course we're not going to talk about the role of AI in killing people. I mean, if that doesn't get tackled within your ethical conceptual framework, then there's an extent to which you're being complicit in a charade, effectively. And it's going to, in a way it was suggested earlier, it's going to come back the other way unless, a solution or response is undertaken within the military space. That opening the door of allowing AI to be engaged in the sort of function of determining, where force is applied and how people are killed, it's going to have implications on the way that these kind of guidelines are understood if it's allowed to continue. I actually have more confidence than that. I think that what will happen is that at the end of the day, some states will realize that this kind of analysis in the civilian space trumps some of the nonsense they've been saying in the military context, and they're going to think, actually, we need to start taking this a bit more seriously and recognizing that we do need to draw some lines in this military context, because it just can't be squared with what we're saying. There's too much of a tension between the different positions, really.
It's such a great point, and talking about how this is the most high risk that you can get, and you're just leaving that one out conveniently. But then we're going to put some tight regulations on other stuff that is not specifically made for killing and taking lives. So it's a little bit hypocritical to think that way.
No, even not a little bit, very hypocritical. I even was thinking, or is it that the EU Commission says that the European military is developing this or is planning to develop these weapons, but they won't be used in Europe. So what do we care? I mean, I don't know, but as I said, I really would like to meet with someone in the European Commission and just tell me what is it, because this is too stressful for me.
Yeah, that was my question. Why do you think it is?
I just feel like that point about they won't be used in Europe, that brings out another sort of layer of hypocrisy in the same space. When it comes to the analysis of weapon systems and the generation of risks, when we're looking at these technologies to use amongst our own population within our country, there's all sorts of analysis that goes into what can be used and how, and there's sort of public scrutiny and public debate. When we're imagining the technologies being used against foreigners, then suddenly the levels of analysis and the participation of stakeholder groups and the openness and transparency of data, suddenly it's a completely different sort of set of rules and expectations. And I mean, I think that just is a sort of continued underpinning of part of the challenge of military conflict technologies, is that they're assessed and analyzed in a mode that is still constantly not being really accountable to the people who are put at risk, like the civilian populations of the area in which you're going to operate. And there's a sort of just a systematic downgrading of those people as people versus your own population with whom, to whom you're accountable. Okay, ultimately, this is maybe what's this, a critique of the nation state as the sort of organizing unit for the application of force. So, I just don't want to turn this into some world revolution agenda, but there's a set of themes in these areas that technology is implicated in, really.
No, and I think it's important for us to look at those wider issues, Richard and Demetrius, because that's where you start also understanding how different problems and challenges interlock to each other and underpin the discussion as well. So I think they also need to be addressed.
So let's talk for a minute about the people that are creating these weapons. And you mentioned before there's a list of over 1,000 scientists who have signed something saying that they don't want to be a part of it. And I know that there was big uproar within Google for how Google was interfacing with the American military. I don't know if it was specifically on this, but I know that a lot of employees at Google did not like that, and so they staged a walkout. And I'm not sure what happened after that, but that was the big news. And so people that are working on this, is this something that they need to be whistleblowing on? Is this something that they should be raising flags about if they're being asked to work on this? How do you see progress being made in that aspect?
Yeah, I think they're a key community, I think, for us in many respects, right? I think we want to see companies, individuals and companies, expressing support for prohibition on weapon systems in this area. So supporting the development of new international law. So if companies can make commitments not to develop these technologies and can speak up in favor of international rules, then I think that's really valuable to us. And sort of in getting engaged with analysis and perspectives on the technologies too, and the challenges that they would pose if they're put into use in these kind of functions. Because we are still talking a sort of future orientated set of issues, and there is a challenge to developing argumentation in relation to sort of technology and the sort of future of technology. It's difficult enough developing international treaties prohibiting weapons that straightforwardly exist. But in the context of anti-personnel mines, in the context of cluster munitions, there were individual people, there were communities, but there's people who could stand up and they could say, I experienced the harm from this directly, right? I lost my leg, I've lost my child, I've lost my partner from this harm. And so this sort of sense of engagement from an affected population was very important. You don't have that in the same way when you're orientating towards the future. So really the voices of the people who understand the technology and can speak to the sort of the sense of moral concerns that exist within the technology sector and in the tech development sector, I think they're really important to us, and they should be very powerful voices in this debate, have already been very powerful voices in this debate, and we're really appreciative of the extent to which that community supports regulation and constraints on these military uses, recognizing that there's no sense that that's going to curtail the positive and productive development of technology and AI in any way, right? We're only talking about not killing people through the use of machines. It's not going to, it's not going to affect what algorithms can be scripted or anything else. So,
yes, that is a great answer. And now we're coming to the end of our time, and I would like to talk about, just for a minute, the black market of this and how there will be treaties there, or let's imagine that things do get passed and we understand this is not okay to being used. And going back to your point, Richard, about, society does not like this, but they still get used within terrorism situations, or just, I think about like gang wars or these kind of things, and there is a black market for it. Do you foresee some way that the technology will be completely banned and dismantled and it won't be able to get into the hands of others? Not whatsoever? Or will there be still this underground use of it?
Well, I'm not sure I really sort of see it or frame it in those terms. I mean, I think what we're talking about here is systems that function in a certain way. So I don't think, we're not really talking about just necessarily unified robotic objects that move around, sensing their environment and applying force just in one discrete unit. It could be a combination of sensors on a platform here and computer analysis of that sensor data there and sending signals to another unit to apply force over here. I think it's the looping together in a system that is the issue, rather than the idea of some sort of just sort of unified robot entity. That's not to say that you couldn't have unified entities that function this way, but I just don't see them being, I don't see them being a sort of black market commodity that confers any real advantage on you. Well, overall, like you said earlier on chemical weapons, there's always probably going to be people who breach rules. Sometimes people are going to build their identity a little bit out of breaching rules by looking like they're rejecting norms. But we just need to put our confidence in the sort of strength of the overarching position. Finally, I think my main concern in this space is not terrorist groups or rogue actors. It's major militaries who are looking at the world and thinking about state peer-to-peer conflict and how to marshal a sort of mass effect against each other. And it's those fantasies that are driving the development of technologies and thinking in this area, really. And it's in that space that we need to have the effect first and foremost. So I think if we can tackle this at the state level, that's where the bulk of the concerns really lie.
And let me also please give an example that I like to share, like to look at how a treaty can support or prevent, respond to these kind of issues. An example from the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, that now recently here in Mexico, there was a lot of upheaval because it so happened that there was, I don't know if you have heard about it, but a massacre in one of many massacres in the south of Mexico of students that were studying to be teachers. And then there were 43 of them that were killed and some more disappeared. And there was a role from the local police, etc. And time passed by, we still don't know what happened. We still don't know where they are. There's a lot of problems. But what we know is that German weapons were used in that massacre by the police. And those German weapons were exported supposedly for military use, and they were supposed to be used by the military and not in this particular state because of the human rights violations. And they found their way to this place. And so the Arms Trade Treaty allows to look at this and to realize and to denounce what is going on and to prevent it from going on. So you could say, yes, but there's other groups using other weapons. Yes, there's many things going on that we need to address. But having a treaty allows you to give visibility to these things, to ask for accountability and try to ensure this doesn't happen in the future.
Yes. The accountability and the enabling that it does. I see that point completely. So many great points being made. And I could talk to you all for the whole afternoon about this. I think this is a fascinating subject, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing in this field to try and move it forward. And like you said, Richard, it is got to be incredibly hard to enact treaties on weapons that are in the future or that are potentially going to be created, as we have a hard enough time enacting treaties on weapons that are being used right now. So I think it's an incredible task that you're both undertaking. I thank you so much for it. I have one last question, and I'll say it to the both of you. I'll let Richard start. Richard, are you a robot?
Not a robot, thank you, Demetrios, but I've enjoyed talking to you, and not a robot yet anyway.
All right, Wanda, how about yourself?
Happily, I am not a robot. Are you
Excellent.
a robot, Demetrios?
I don't think so, but I don't know if I can say for 100% sure.
We can't be sure.
But yeah,
it's going to turn out that we were speaking with a bot all this time, Richard.
Exactly. Yes. Well, thank you again. This has been wonderful, and really all the best for this project and this movement. If anyone wants to continue and reach out to you, what's the best way to do it and get involved in this project?
They can contact us through websites. We're at www.article36.org. Also, stopkillerrobots.org.
And if you like anyone listening to us in Spanish, CELAC, SEHLAC.org.
And on Twitter at RJ Moyes.
I don't know what's the name. Help me out. At underscore, is it? The line?
Yeah.
At underscore Wanda, MUNOZ.
Perfect. We'll throw all of that in the show link or the show notes too, so that people can just click on it, make it easier for them. But thanks again, y'all.
Thank you, Demetrius.
This has been awesome.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks a lot.